Happening from April to August in 1898, the war began after the United States demanded a solution to the problem of Cuban independence, which Spain refused. At that time, the expansionism in the United States was high, prompting the government to draw up a plan to annex Spain's long-occupied overseas territories, including the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. In 1895, there was an armed uprising against the Spanish authorities in Cuba. Organizations outside of Cuba, particularly those based in the United States, provided financial support for the insurgency. In response, the new governor of Cuba, General Valeriano Weyler, vowed to crush the rebellion by isolating the rebels from the population. By the end of 1897, more than 300,000 Cubans had been relocated to concentration camps controlled by Spain. These camps were overcrowded and unsanitary, leading to the deaths of thousands of people. Cuban exiles in the United States launched a propaganda campaign against Weyler in Spain, winning the sympathy of the American public. The American press began to call for intervention in Cuba due to Spain's mistreatment of the Cuban people. Weyler was labeled a butcher by newspapers. In January 1898, riots occurred in Havana when Cuban supporters of Spain burned 3 newspapers that had criticized General Weyler. As a result, there were concerns about the safety of Americans living in Havana, because there was increasing hostility towards Cuban independence among Hispanic Cubans in the United States. In response, the United States sent the U.S. Maine, a battleship, to Havana to protect American interests in case the situation got worse. The ship arrived on January 25, 1898, and remained there without incident until the following month. On February 15, 1898, at 9:40 p.m., the battleship Maine exploded and sunk in the harbor of Havana, killing 266 sailors. After the explosion of the battleship Maine, American newspapers blamed Spanish officials in Cuba for the incident. The publication of these sensationalized reports of atrocities committed by Spain in Cuba incited anger among the American public. Initially, President William McKinley, the Congress, and the business community opposed the push for war. However, after Senator Redfield Proctor delivered a speech detailing the situation and arguing that war was the only appropriate course of action, many in the commercial and religious communities who had previously opposed the war changed their stance. On April 11, McKinley asked Congress for permission to send troops to Cuba with the aim of ending the Civil War there. Later, Congress passed a joint resolution in favor of Cuban independence, rejecting any attempt to annex Cuba, but demanding that Spain withdraw its troops. The resolution also authorized the president to use military force to help Cuba gain independence. President McKinley signed the resolution on April 20, and an ultimatum was sent to Spain. In response, Spain cut diplomatic ties with the United States and declared war on April 23. On April 25, Congress declared a state of war between the United States and Spain. During the 333 years of Spanish rule in the Philippines, the country underwent significant development from a small overseas colony governed from Mexico to a land with modern elements in its cities. The 19th century middle classes in the Philippines were largely educated in liberal European ideas, and among these educated individuals was José Rizal, the Filipino national hero who demanded more reforms from the Spanish authorities. This movement ultimately led to the Philippine Revolution against Spanish colonial rule. The revolution had been in a state of truce since the signing of the Pact of Biak-ng-Bato in 1897, with revolutionary leaders having accepted exile outside the country. The first battle of the Spanish-American War took place at Manila Bay on May 1, 1898. Vice Admiral George Dewey, commanding the U.S. Navy's Asia Squadron on the battleship U.S. Olympia, easily defeated the Spanish naval delegation under Admiral Patricio Montojo y Pesaran. After Dewey's victory, Manila Bay was filled with British, German, French, and Japanese warships, all of which outnumbered Dewey's forces. Dewey then brought Emilio Aguinaldo, who was in exile in Hong Kong, to the Philippines to rally the Filipinos against the Spanish colonial government. On June 12, 1898, Aguinaldo declared Philippine independence. At the same time, Colonel Henry Glass was on board the U.S. Charleston when he received orders to take possession of the island of Guam. Upon arriving there on June 20, he hoisted the American flag and fired on the island. A Spanish officer, not knowing that the war had been declared, approached the American warship and asked to borrow some dynamite to return the American salutes. Glass immediately arrested the officer and held him as a prisoner of war, After promising, the officer was ordered to return to the island to discuss the terms of surrender. The next day, 54 Spanish infantrymen were captured and the island fell into American hands. In the late 19th century, many Cubans sought the involvement of the United States government in their fight for independence from Spain. The American public showed overwhelming support for their cause, giving the Cubans reassurance that they would receive help. On May 11, 1898, American and Spanish forces engaged in their first combat in the Caribbean, with American naval officers successfully destroying undersea communication cables near Cienfuegos to sever communication between Cuba and Spain. In June, American forces landed in Cuba and engaged Spanish soldiers in the Battle of Las Guasimas, followed by the battles of El Caney and San Juan Hill in July. Despite heavy losses on both sides, the American advance towards Santiago was halted by the Spanish, who successfully defended Fort Canosa. The Americans and Cubans then began a long siege of the city, with Cuban General Calixto Garcia making advances towards the Spanish positions. During this time, the major goal of sea operations was the capture of the port of Santiago de Cuba, which was located near Guantanamo Bay. This port was strategically important because it could provide shelter for ships during the Atlantic hurricane season. The invasion of Guantanamo Bay took place from June 6 to 10, 1898, and involved a naval assault followed by a successful landing of Marine forces with naval support. Spanish and American forces fought each other for several weeks in the port. On July 3, the Spanish squadron attempted to leave the port, but American forces destroyed 5 of the 6 ships. In total, 1,612 Spanish sailors, including Admiral Cervera, were captured and taken to Seavey Island in Maine, where they were held until mid-September. In May 1898, Lieutenant Henry H. Whitney provided the U.S. government with maps and information on Spanish military forces in Puerto Rico. On May 10, American warships arrived off the coast of Puerto Rico and bombarded San Juan on May 12. On July 25, U.S. General Nelson A. Miles and 3,300 troops began Operation Puerto Rico by landing in Guernica, but encountered resistance from Spanish and Puerto Rican loyalists in battles such as Yauco, Fajardo, and Como. The American commanders withdrew on August 9 after clashing with Spanish and loyalist forces at Cerro Gervasio del Asomante, and all military operations were suspended after the Paris Agreement was announced later that night. With the defeats in Cuba and the Philippines, Spain called for peaceful dialogue. Hostilities ended on August 12, 1898, with the signing of a peace decree between the United States and Spain at Washington, D.C. The official peace treaty was signed in Paris on December 10, 1898. The United States' swift victory in the war brought a boost to Americans' morale, confidence, and determination. The United States acquired nearly all of the Spanish colonies at that time, including the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico. Cuba alone, occupied by the United States until July 17, 1898, established its own civilian government and was later granted independence by the United States on May 20, 1902. The United States also established a perpetual lease of Guantanamo Bay. This war had far-reaching consequences for both countries. It ultimately ended with the United States emerging victorious, and Spain was forced to cede control of several territories. The Spanish-American War was a pivotal moment in history that marked the beginning of the United States' rise to global superpower status.